Okay, everyone, welcome to PRIO, friends, colleagues. My name is. Oh, I have to talk in the. Sorry, I have to speak into this. Okay, I'll stand here very still. Okay, thank you, Agneta. Welcome to PRIO. My name is Håkon Gjerlev. I'm the acting director here at the Research Institute. And I want to welcome you to the European Security Week. And we all know the backdrop for this event. The war in Ukraine, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, continues to rage. It has now, the most recent numbers we have is that it has costed us more than or almost 400,000 battle deaths, casualties in combat. Others report casualties up to the number of 2 million. That's just the human toll. And then in addition comes the economic consequences, the societal consequences. And this war has major implications for European security, but not just defense. It has major implications for our technologies, military technologies, civilian technologies. It has diplomatic consequences, geopolitical ones. It has economic consequences. The ramifications of this war is all over the place. And it is reshaping how Europe plans to be Europe. The war has coincided with a democratic backlash around the globe. Notably, in the US, one of the most important strategic partners of Europe. And this double whammy is definitely shaping how Europe thinks about its security prospects. This is not just about military defense, and the European Security Week is not just about military defense. It is about how the wars and the changing realities of our world is changing European democratic resilience, our economic priorities, our industrial and technological policies, regulations, AI, and our social cohesion. It is in many ways fitting that the week starts the day after the 17th of May. You will see some tired faces around the room, and that's either because people yesterday had to get up at 5 to bring their children to the children's parade, or because they started the day drinking champagne. And the 17th of May, we celebrate Norwegian independence and democracy. It is at the core of what it is that we are trying to defend when we're talking about European security. Norway has Russia as a close neighbor in the high north. We are heavily dependent on strong allies in Europe, in the US. So the issues at stake are directly impacting Norway specifically. But we are also reminded that the Norwegian Constitution, the Constitution Day, 17th of May, is a result of wars where Germany was pitted against France, where Norway and Denmark, or Denmark-Norway, was pitted against Sweden. It is a reminder that European security and European collaboration is just not a question of defense against external threats, but it's also a question about maintaining the peace at our continent between our allies. A continent that is not at all guaranteed to have peace when we look into the long historical lines. How can Europe build this new security system while simultaneously preserving its democratic values? This is at the core of what will be discussed during the European Security Week. It is also at the core of PRIO's mission. We do research on the peaceful conditions, or the conditions for peaceful relations between nations, groups, and individuals. And the European Security Week touches on all of those questions. For many years, that research agenda that brought us to Africa, it brought us to the Middle East, it brought us to Asia, but now it is also increasingly bringing us back to Europe. I therefore want to thank all of you for coming here. I want to thank our distinguished experts from Europe and elsewhere. I want to thank the people who have been organizing this. I think Nick has played a large part in that. Thank you, Nick. And I want to thank Koms for helping us out with organizing the events. Thank you everyone for coming. We will start the week by discussing Norway's role in the rapidly evolving security landscape. We will continue on Wednesday with 2 events. There we will be looking at the European rearmament, but also the roles of technology, energy, and diplomacy. On Thursday, there are 2 more events where we will discuss more the cognitive threats and questions of democratic resilience, but also the struggle for influence between Russia and the EU in the global order. And on Friday, we will conclude the week by discussing internal drivers of Russian policies towards Europe, domestic politics, and on the contribution of critical approaches to security technology. So we have a bunch of very interesting topics that touch on all of the themes that I have now mentioned throughout the week. So welcome today, but also welcome for the rest of the week, and have a good European Security Week.
Okay, so thanks to Håkon for setting the stage. My name is Siri Åsrustad. I'm leading this panel discussion. But before starting, I need to tell you that the fire exits are this way and that way, and toilets are also this way. Also, this event will be streamed live. So there is quite a big audience around the world online, which also means that you guys need to talk into your microphones and not do like Håkon. Okay. Today's panel discussion is on Norway's role in a rapidly evolving European security landscape. And to discuss this, I have my distinguished colleagues from PRIO, starting here with Marianne Dahl, who's a research director at PRIO. She specializes on mass mobilization and how violent conflict shapes political attitudes, including recent work from Ukraine during wartime. Then we have Louise Olson, senior researcher here at PRIO, specializes on peace operation and gender aspects of security. She focuses on societal factors influencing resilience. Coming to Nick Marsh, who is a senior researcher at PRIO. He researches the political economy of defense in Europe, including arms procurement, military aid, and defense production. And finally, Bruno Oliveira Martins is a senior researcher at PRIO. He's an expert on European security, especially on how new technology is shifting geopolitical dynamics, affecting security governance in practice. So we have a very varied panel who's going to answer some of the questions that we have. So we will have a panel discussion about 30-40 minutes, and then we will open up for Q&A from the audience. So the first question, we'll start with Marianne, is what are the most important lessons Norway can learn from Ukraine regarding societal resilience and technology adoption?
Okay, is this working? Oh, nice. Okay, so I'll make a very shallow statement, which people who know far more about it can challenge me on later. But if we took a quick look at Russia's military capabilities and Ukraine's before the war and focused on the number of soldiers, the amount of military equipment, this shouldn't have been such a hard war for Russia to win. But that's not how things were going to unfold. It has been a pretty difficult war for Russia not to win. 3 years later, 4 years later, 4 years later. Yes, thank you. So what Ukraine has is an exceptionally high fighting moral. In any war, who wins is going to be shaped by how willing people are to fight in that war. And of course, maybe it's not that surprising. Russians are fighting for a war which is deeply embedded in Putin's own view that Ukraine shouldn't be its own sovereign state, while Ukrainians are fighting for their nation's survival. That often generates like a higher willingness to fight. But Ukraine is also fighting. Ukrainian soldiers also find themselves in an increasingly, or what had become in 2022, an increasingly democratic system. And we know from research that democratic countries are generally more efficient at fighting wars. In democracies, there is greater room for initiative among soldiers. There is more decentralized decision-making, and there is more adaptability under pressure. And that, in turn, tends to make soldiers better at fighting the wars. So that's good. And Ukraine, besides everything that has happened, has continued to have a generally high fighting moral and do well. So what has happened? So one thing that could have happened in Ukraine was that commitment to democracy had become weaker. That would also have been a win for Putin. But instead, it was around when people in Ukraine were asked before the full-scale invasion how important it was for them to live in a democratic country. It was kind of lukewarm, around 40%. But after the full-scale invasion, that number has increased to 70%, more or less. It comes ebbs and flows a little bit. But in many societies, when they are met with violence, it tends to lead to an erosion of democratic commitment. And we haven't seen this so much in Ukraine, which is pretty good. So for Norway, what to learn from this is societies are ultimately defended by people who think their political system is worthwhile to defend. If Norway was to be attacked, we would have to keep that capability. Of course, now all the discussion is about how do we make sure we have the weapons to be resilient or to fight against a threat, and that's important. But we also need to make sure that we continue to have a political system that we feel is worthwhile to fight for. Thank you. Was that 2 minutes? 4?
More or less. Thanks, Marianne. Bruno, what can you add on this? Can you challenge Marianne on this?
I think that I will not challenge, actually. I think that the importance of having a relevant sense of purpose is quite striking, and I think it's playing a very important role in the way that the war in Ukraine is unfolding. And so I think that a sense of purpose and the national cohesion can lead to creative thinking and long-term resistance to a stronger power. So I think this is quite important. And so, you know, if our point of analysis is what can Norway learn from the conflict, I think that this is one of the important things, is to understand what keeps society together. You know, and of course, democratic principles is a very important part of that. Like, what kind of society do we want to be? You know, compared to what kind of society could we become? But I also think that a crucial dynamic in the war in Ukraine is the role of technology and the way that war is actually being fought and how this has changed over time. You know, like the conflict has gone through many different phases. But we see that the kind of the starting point and the balance of power that existed at the starting point of the war has shifted, and technology played a very important part in this. So, and you know, and we can talk in more detail about what types of technology, you know, under which dynamics, under which conditions, etc. But I think that this general understanding that technology can help tip the balance in different directions. So if this is a reality, or if we agree on this, then this has some implications in terms of what, you know, what comes next in terms of preparing a society, have a more resilient, more prepared society. And I think that having a more informed, educated, skilled society with a sense of purpose can go a very long way in increasing resilience. I also think that it's very important here, and kind of, and this is something that I always introduce when we talk about lessons learned from Ukraine. Because there is this, I think that there is a lot of very well justified enchantment with the way that technology has, evolved so rapidly, and how Ukrainians have been so skillful that repurposing technology, developing new technology, immediately putting them in the battlefield. And I think that there might be a tendency in some people to thinking, okay, this is exactly what we have to do, creating that technological ecosystem that allows this very rapid innovation. I don't believe in that. I think that many of the things that are fascinating in the context of Ukraine are not things that should be necessarily or automatically reproduced in peacetime Norway, for example, okay, or in other European countries. I think that, for example, this very quick prototype to production to deployment cycles, it's something that is justified in the wartime, but it's not justified in peacetime. Okay, and the same applying, for example, this very radical deregulation that we've seen in Ukraine. That is not something that we should foster in Norway, from my perspective, and also the speed at which AI in a military context has been developed and deployed. So I think that it is a fundamental distinction whether we are in peacetime or we are in wartime, and I think it's important to keep this in mind.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, thanks, Bruno. I'll just expand a bit on the two last few points you were making about the sort of technological adaptation. And certainly what we've seen in the Ukraine war, by both sides, by Ukraine and by Russia, is what we tend to see in wars in general, which is rapid technological developments, which have completely transformed the way that the war is being fought now compared to how it was being fought in 2022. Certainly, as Bruno mentioned, the speed of this adaptation and innovation has been extremely important. And one of the crucial aspects there has been as Bruno mentioned, the Ukrainians' ability to set up ecosystems of small firms and not rely on sort of cozy relationships between the government and large defense firms, which, in general we see resulting in very slow progress, high cost overruns, etc. But then and this has been combined with people, as Bruno mentioned, on the front lines also being directly involved in developing the technology, something, again, which would be very alien to sort of Western European armed forces. And then the difficulty there is, how is it possible for a country to adapt that within peacetime? And that brings very large problems in terms of accountability, oversight, which tends to require detailed, long-term, time-consuming examination, checking, etc. So that's one of the things which, for example, Norway might have to grapple with in the event of an increase in hostility, is to what extent can it let go of normal processes of government and try to rapidly speed things up. And then the second thing is what we've seen is breaking down the barriers between government and the rest of society involved in innovation. For example, in Ukraine, we've seen not just firms, but volunteer groups producing drones, civil society organizations, links with local government. And again, that creates lots of dilemmas in terms of the extent to which you want defense issues to be taking over large areas of what had been thought of as civilian, in particular academic research in universities. And to what extent should that be seen as independent, or should that be seen as part of the sort of broader societal effort?
Louise?
Yeah, I think sort of connecting, the dots between just what Nick ended and where Marianne started. I think it's I think Ukraine in many ways have really demonstrated sort of the need for the whole of society resistance, or that how that constitutes the foundation of resilience. So the connectedness between the military and civilian defense and the societal functionality of a society under stress for an extremely long time period. And when you look at the current total defense discussions in Norway, but also in Sweden and the other Nordic countries, it's still very much a question of sort of the state and the regions and the municipalities. They are organizing their plans. It's a very sort of detached almost approach to the population. And when the population is mentioned, it's that we should all have a water home for a week or something like that. So it's a very detached approach, even though we see from Ukraine that it's probably the dependency actually goes in the other direction. It's the state and the municipalities that are completely dependent on societal contributions and upholding society functionality over a long time period. So it's a dugnad som heter duga, if you want to translate it to Scandinavian. But that also means that an almost incomprehensible whole of society cost. I don't think we can comprehend the complete cost for the Ukraine society, both in terms of death, but also in terms of major human development costs, sort of losing human capital over time. And that also goes in terms of both mental and physical health. For instance, that PTSD, even far away from the front line, is quite high and rising. And also that societal networks around, for instance, students or in contexts where we normally would think of social networking as a very positive thing, can actually reinforce trauma. And also, for instance, decreased birth weight in children, etc. So the long-term consequences for society of this kind of warfare, and how we estimate not only sort of being prepared for a week, but also mentally prepared for a longer time period, is something I think we should try to find strategies to bring home in a better way.
Thank you, all of you. We're moving on to more our European partners, asking what are the implications for Norway of the recent rapid changes in the European security institutions, including the EU and NATO. Bruno, could you start us on that?
Yes, I think that the departing point here in this debate is that the way that the EU approaches defense issues has gone through a fundamental change over the last 4 years. And I think it's very important that we put this on the table, because this is the framework of discussion. So, and when we debate how Norway can relate to those developments, we need to understand that this is not just business as usual. This is not a little bit more money. This is a fundamentally different way that the EU, in this case, deals with the issues of security and defense. And I would say all these dynamics that we have been witnessing, from the very first days after the Russian invasion of Ukraine a few years ago, has only been intensified over the last 12, 13, 15 months in relation to the Trump's presidency of the US. So I think that those two things combined create a very different security landscape in Europe, in which the EU is increasingly relevant. Of course, this means that there are implications also to the countries that are around Europe. And for the case of Norway, this is also quite striking, because, as everyone here in this room knows, Norway is not a member of the EU, but has a very close and intersected and enmeshed relation with the European Union in many aspects, in dozens and dozens of policy areas. It has also increased defense cooperation with the EU in recent years, started a new partnership agreement. But what is really quite striking here is that Norway, as a non-member of the EU, does not have an influence on the decisions that are made. So Norway is fundamentally affected by them, but is not, but does not sit at the table, in those endless meetings behind closed doors when decisions are made. And of course, Norway and Norwegian citizens have voted twice against becoming members of the EU. that is, there are very strong arguments against membership of the EU. But I honestly, as a EU citizen, I'm not Norwegian, I'm Portuguese. As a EU citizen, I find it very strange that, that these decisions were made. But in particular, I think that the EU that Norwegians voted against becoming a member of in 1994 simply does not exist anymore. It's a fundamentally different organization. Has many more members, much more competence, etc. And so I think that this is something that needs to be on the table. There is going to be a quite relevant referendum in Iceland in August, this upcoming August, about renegotiating Iceland's relation with the EU that may lead possibly to a referendum on membership. And this is something that can weaken EU's position in for example, if Iceland votes for a closer relationship with the EU, this is something that can weaken Norway's position, because suddenly Norway would become more isolated as a country is out, that gravitates around the EU but does not but is not a member. Final thing that I would say is that the fact that Sweden and Finland are now members of NATO is something that also changes the geopolitics of Northern Europe, and this is something that also impacts Norway quite substantially. We can talk more about that afterwards.
Okay, thank you. Nick, as a, I guess, ex-EU member, what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, certainly the EU is now one of the most important defense security actors in Europe. I mean, they're trying to mobilize 800 billion in funding for defense procurement, building up defense industries. I mean, this is enormous and unprecedented. At the same time, the US role in Europe. I mean, if we're being polite, we have to say it's unreliable. I think we have to assume that it's over in terms of Europeans thinking that they can rely on the US to step in and, save us. And we've seen that over and over again. And also, I mean, I think there's a temptation to assume that, well, maybe if we get a nice Democrat in the White House again, things will be back to how they were. And I really don't think that that's a reasonable assumption. Whether or not Trump's in the White House, the MAGA constituency is there. It's going to dictate policy. So the old days are over. But that leaves a question then as, okay, if Europe has to take responsibility for its defense and security, which direction is it going to take? And there, you can see three separate orientations, if you like. I mean, I'm being very, very broad brush here, so indulge me. But if we're looking at, say, Paris, Berlin, Brussels, and the EU Commission, you can definitely see what you can see. See as Euro-Gaullism. I mean, the idea that Europe should be independent for its own sake, that Europe, should embrace strategic autonomy, and therefore what's going on in Washington is an opportunity for Europe to sort of embrace its destiny. Certainly in Northern Europe, parts of Central and Eastern Europe, though not all of it, there's definitely a focus on, okay, we need to defend ourselves, and we need to focus on building up defense capability as quickly as possible. And the dilemma there is that Europe has been dependent upon importing equipment from the US. And not just defense equipment, dual-use equipment such as, Elon Musk's Starlink has been absolutely vital in Ukraine, as an example. So there's the whole of the, large parts of the technology that Europeans are dependent upon is imported from the US. Now, to what extent are we able to fulfill these ambitions for strategic autonomy and also do without US technology? I really don't know. And further, are Europeans willing to pay for the costs of establishing independent tech firms? So that's a huge dilemma. For Norway, obviously, the danger is being left out of the what's going on in Europe, but also not having a strong ally across the Atlantic. I don't know. I'm not sure that I agree with Bruno. I think maybe the answer is to carry on just trying to be as close to the EU as possible without actually being a member, and that might be the best compromise. And certainly the rest of Europe is dependent upon Norwegian energy exports. So there's a strong sort of coincidence of interest there, at least. Anyway.
Thank you. Luis, your thoughts on this?
I think just adding to the point in terms of the whole of society, because it's as we now see this shift in the EU towards defense and security, and of course NATO, sort of the collaboration with NATO and the strong emphasis on the military build-up and the focus on more traditional forms of security, of course, always comes with trade-offs in terms of other normatives and other political priorities where the EU had a much stronger profile in the past. And we also know that, of course, this trade-off between the military and the more societally sort of development-focused areas are, of course, a question also of resource distributions. So just being aware of sort of how we are being tagged along in those kind of processes and what the implications are for small societies such as the Nordics, where we actually need the whole of society to be able to contribute. And one of those core norms to us would be gender equality, and of course in relation to that, women, peace and security. And we can see in the debate in NATO and EU at the present moment that those are being either treated as something of the past or something of an international operation focus, or it's being part of political contentions. Or it's becoming deprioritized because you cannot connect it to the current debate. So I think we need a thinking around, if we're actually in our small societies thinking about turning this into more like we're following along on the defense trail, what are the other implications and trade-offs? And how do we, in a sense, position ourselves, given that the US has also gone on the offense against one of our core values, which is gender equality?
Thanks. Then moving on to a topic that we have already touched a little bit on, technology. Nick, can you say something about how Norway is affected by the rapid development in military technologies, particularly AI and drones?
Norway is extremely vulnerable. What we've seen, in Ukraine and Russia, if you've been watching the headlines just over the last few days, refineries in Russia, hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from Ukraine burning. The Norwegian offshore installations, the entire energy sector is extremely vulnerable. Norway also has a very large land area, very dispersed population. That makes defense against drones extremely difficult. You're having to spread your defenses very thinly. We've got the border with Russia in the high north. Obviously, that's an immediate route by which Norway could be attacked. All of these things mean that building up drone defenses should be an absolutely key component, not just of preparing for war, but of deterrence, of trying to make it as unrealistic as possible for Russia to actually launch an attack using drones against Norway. And secondly, we've got the rapid developments in AI. These make it even more difficult to counter drones. One technique that had been used in Ukraine was using electronic countermeasures to prevent the drone, having a data link back to the operator. With AI, you don't need that. You just tell the AI, okay, look for this kind of target. The drone is autonomous. There's no need for that data link. So that means drone defense is rapidly becoming obsolete. So this development In AI, this is also obviously affecting interceptors, the ways in which attacking drones can be very quickly intercepted as well. And there's a need then for the rapid innovation and technological innovation that we were talking about earlier. But again, that's difficult and very costly, as we were saying. And the wholesale adoption of artificial intelligence. I suspect Bruno will talk about this, so I won't go into it at length. But this poses huge ethical dilemmas, especially for a democratic society that values human rights. And to what extent are we willing to let algorithms make potentially huge decisions about life and death? But I'll leave that to Bruno.
Yeah, thanks. Well, you've covered quite a lot the part on vulnerabilities, which was something that I think it really needs to be on the table. I will not kind of go much further into that. I will just reinforce that if we look at in the case of Norway, for example, if we look at the geography of Norway, an enormous coasts, a very long coastline with fjords and islands and everything, and extremely large and populated areas, the possibility and the vulnerabilities will always be there, and the possibilities for an attack will always be there. So I think that we should really get rid of this idea that how can we achieve total security? That is not on the table for any country, but particularly for a country with the characteristics of Norway. We just have to live with that, as we've always lived, and that doesn't have to be a problem. That doesn't mean that there are things that cannot be done and should not be done, and that is absolutely the situation. Protection of some critical infrastructure needs to be prioritary. We saw that in recent months and recent years we've seen disruptions in airports, in dams, in oil facilities located offshore, etc. So I think that there needs to be a very clear prioritization about what counts as critical infrastructure that needs to be protected. I also wanted to say, a little bit in line of these last points that Nick made, that we shouldn't focus only on vulnerabilities and challenges. I think that there are possibilities that come out of these, technological developments. I will not be the one making the case for trying to develop the advancing the the cutting edge and the state of the art of new weapons at all. But I think that there is a new possibility when you have a new technology coming up in the market and in the real world. There is a new possibility for regulating it and to establishing standards according to which the development and the deployment and use of those technologies can be accepted. And I think that this is one of the possibilities where a country with the characteristics of Norway can have leverage to really make a mark in the international scene. So I think that the regulatory governance and tech diplomacy are areas where Norway can emerge as an important international player and these are opportunities that are opened up by these new trends in technology developments.
Thank you. We're moving on to a topic and a phrase that has become more and more common in our discussions. What does total defense mean today? What threats may involve drones, cyber, supply chains, disinformation, infrastructure attacks, and public moral? Louise, can you start us off on this topic?
I'll start, and then I look forward to the complementary input by the other panelists, because I think it's a very, very well captured by Nick and Bruno's remarks now. It's scenarios that are very difficult to estimate exactly what the outcome will be, and I think that's also why we rely so much on the examples from Ukraine, even though we know that a war between Russia and NATO would not look exactly like this, but it sort of helps us to sort of start to calculate different kinds of effects. And I think in a way that involves this movement from a Cold War thinking of the total defense to the updated one, because I think in many respects it's useful, the total defense term, in a way that is something that people can resonate with. It's a term that we can relate to. At the same time, it also comes with the danger of thinking of this as we did during the Cold War, where the Nordics were at the outskirts of geopolitical tensions. It was a tradition of close military-civilian cooperations and ideas of social responsibility that I'm not sure exists fully today. So it's in a way, sort of, how do we in a way take the population that's with us through this journey? So I very much look forward to the outcome of this total defense year, and I hope that there are researchers connected to that process in order to actually make it estimate what these kind of campaigns can look like more efficiently. Because I think it is a way of thinking that also will involve different regions. So today we know that the High North and the Arctic is actually at the core of all the geopolitical players. And Norway and Sweden are the countries that have the largest population in the Nordic region that are actually living in the High North. And that also means that part of the population, most of those will fill critical functions in terms of a defense. And I think when I've carried out these kind of discussions with Norwegian and Swedish counterparts, it quite often results back to something like, yeah, well, I will go to my hytta and I will just, retract from society and just wait it out. But in truth, in small states like the Nordics, we are basically all going to have to be continuing to support a society over time. And if you live in the High North, that means that particularly in healthcare, in production, you're going to have to maintain that production. But that also means that there will be groups, vulnerable groups, locked in those regions that will not be able to get out. So how are we thinking around children, how we think around elderly, how we're thinking around refugee groups also moving between the Nordic countries. So it requires quite a detailed understanding up there, considering that most of us will be critical. In the south, however, we know, of course, from drone warfare and the use of air warfare in Ukraine, that the cities will primarily be also very much in target. So down for us in the southern parts, it will require a way of thinking around. I will not be without water I don't need water for just 7 days. I'm going to need to be able to live with this for a longer time period. I'm going to have to live without functioning sewage. I'm going to have to live without functioning electricity. And that's a mentality that I think we are very far from today. So the Total Defense 2.0 is going to require some discussions, pedagogical ones, that doesn't scare people. And that's why I'm thinking that it's critical, for instance, with the research that Marianne does on the willingness to defend. How are we actually thinking around, and how can we make sure that we have credible scenarios?
Thank you. Bruno, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, thanks a lot. I think this is really interesting on the issue of how disruptive technologies challenge the total defense concept. I would like to maybe call your attention to this report called Disruptive Technology and the Total Defense Concept, Insights from Norway, that we published in 2023, and it's available online. And here we explore exactly this. How the growth of importance in dual-use technologies poses new challenges to exactly the idea of total defense. And one of them is really it is a scenario that has been fully revealed or fully confirmed by the war in Ukraine, which is when you have a particular technological skill in a technology that is, dual use in nature. This is something that, might come in handy. But at the same time, you also need technological knowledge to better defend yourself, to better understand how to increase the cyber resilience of a dam, for example, so that you don't allow a cyber attack has happened in Norway not so long ago. So all of this is also reinforced by the growing digitalization of society. Okay, this is something that increases resilience in one domain, but if it's not done in the right way, it also opens up new vulnerabilities. And Norway is a society that is very digitalized, and there needs to be an understanding that when you have a society that is very digitalized, you increase resilience in one aspect, but you open up new vulnerabilities that really need to be attended for. And so all of this is changing a little bit the way that we understand civil-military relations today. So this logic of dual-use technologies, which means technologies that have both a civil and a military application, at least potentially, is really crucial to understand what total defense means for Norway today.
Nick, what is your thinking around that?
I think when we're thinking of total defense, we have to, at the back of our minds, be aware that, war is a complete waste. Defense is a complete waste in terms of, at the level of humanity. If the human race were able to not be worried about war, able to not have to spend resources on defense, we'd all be better off. Unfortunately, we're not in that position, and we have to spend a certain amount. But that means, inherent in any discussion on total defense is all the considerations of the trade-offs that are being made. These concern resources. They concern people. At a human level. My 17-year-old son may well be called up to serve in the military. That may and may not be a good thing for him, but for society, that means that young people are in the military who would be doing better things outside if we lived in a peaceful world, which unfortunately we don't. But these trade-offs also affect the willingness of the population to sustain this total defense effort. If we take healthcare, for example, large debates in Norway about lack of capacity in the healthcare system, people having to wait too long for treatment, etc. But if we're thinking of healthcare's contribution to total defense, we then need to think of, resources need to be directed towards supporting that defense effort, which maybe not be the same allocation as they would be if you wanted to, treat people for, in the civilian sector as quickly as possible. Now, again, it may well be that we have to do that, but it also involves a lot of difficult choices for society and a lot of sacrifices.
Marianne, what is total defense for you?
Okay, so I'll talk about a little bit more about the challenges to total defense. So in Norway, when people in Norway are asked, would you be willing to fight for your country if war was to come? The numbers who would be willing to do so is extremely high, like high up in the 90s, which ranks Norway at the top or amongst the highest share of people willing to fight for their country. That's good if war is to happen, although war is a complete missed opportunity of resources. But we do want people to be willing to fight if war is to happen. So I'll pick up on one of Bruno's points about new digital technologies, like social platforms. So before, it wasn't the state in Norway who had control over the information that was going around, but it was quite transparent. It was newspapers with editors who followed certain guidelines. When books were published, we knew normally who the author was. But now we find ourselves in a world where a lot is happening on digital platforms, Snapchat, Instagram, Facebook, and then there's the entire dark web. And that, of course, means, as Bruno pointed to, that we generate new vulnerabilities. What happens when people who felt as they were part of the society start to develop identities in parallel communities, which is what is happening for some people at least? What happens when the communication moves from these more open newspapers to these social platforms? That creates an opportunity for anyone outside of Norway who wants to polarize and make sure that this shared communality that we hold at the moment is less shared. So if I was to do one thing, it would be to start with, we are an extremely digital society. We also introduced iPads very early on in school. There's a whole discussion in Norway and many other countries now, like how do we protect children from social platforms? There's like in several countries, we're now discussing maybe we shouldn't do that before they turn 15, 16, 17. Maybe we should let them develop some sort of identity, critical thinking before they go into these spheres. And I'm thinking at the moment, that's important not only for their well-being, but also for the type of society we are creating.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. What are the most important foundations for societal resilience in Norway and the Nordic region? Louise?
Yeah, I think I want to continue to build on what Marianne just said, because I think it's I read this quote recently that I think very nicely sums up what we mean by resilience. So it's the goal of the societal preparedness, right? So it's how do we then make sure that the preparedness efforts and methods that we are using are actually resulting in increased resilience? And are we sure that all groups are part of that debate, and also what kind of attitudes and norms are being undermined, and for what purpose are they then being undermined? And here I would like to connect to sort of how we understand how the whole of society works. So if we have the resilience of whole society, cost of whole society, but also that we then need to understand the dynamics of the whole of society. And I think one core part that I really miss in this is the understanding how critical gender equality is to the Nordic states, because sometimes we treat that as a norm. And it's also been very much connected to like international efforts, and quite often you meet this like rolling of the eyes when you bring this up. But if you actually think of gender equality as an organizing principle, that maximizing the resources in the Nordic states by how we have invested in all individuals to try to make sure that for small population we reach maximum outcome. We need to have the same kind of thinking when we're thinking whole of society and societal preparedness in order to actually produce resilience. And we know this from the World War II, and we also know that from the Cold War, that that's actually how we used to operate. But for some reason now we have disconnected our thinking around gender roles to something that is like a separate topic. And I think it actually goes to how we think around mobilizing. So if we all have critical functions in society, how do we then make sure that people actually come to work? Because a war or a scenario of crisis would actually position private responsibilities against public responsibilities. You will not go to work. You will not remain in a region affected if your kids are going to be put in harm's way. You are going to make a choice, and the likelihood is that you're going to choose the private or the public. And you can actually see that as a sort of the subcurrent of the Nordic states, that you're actually starting to think around this. So in both, I think, Norway and Sweden, actually schools and childcare is actually part of total defense planning. We don't think about it that way, because it also has some fairly problematic normative aspects of militarizing all of society. But at the same time, we also know that war sort of actually goes into the very depth of human relationships. So how do we actually think around that and make this then not a vulnerability that we haven't thought around mobilization? Or what is even more important, like Marianne was saying, we're actually now seeing disinformation campaigns online that are trying to pivot young men, particularly against young women, in terms of gender equality norms. And we're seeing this as part of the polarization. And I would say that that's a vulnerability that we are taking very lightly, even though it actually goes to the core of how our societies function.
Thank you. It's quite worrying. Marianne, have you thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll just follow up on Louise's excellent remarks. Nordic resilience has historically depended on high institutional trust, strong civil society, social solidarity, and relatively low polarization. I think Louise is right that this goes to a key part here has also been kindergartens, school systems, and of course we don't want to militarize that, but we want to make sure that these are institutions that helps to feed into a high level of trust and feeling of inclusion. And of course you need to mobilize women also. It seems so self-evident that you want half of the population to contribute to this and not split it in two. Thanks.
Nick?
Yeah, I think, I mean, just sort of building on what Louise was saying, I'll go a bit wider and say that a lot of what needs to underpin sort of genuine societal resilience needs to see a sort of rolling back of the neoliberal, emphasis, which has taken a lot of the Western world over the last decade since the 90s. I mean, certainly to a lesser extent in Oslo compared to Alabama, but even then. The logic of resilience, for example, means that you want to have excess capacity in terms of resources. You need backup energy. You need backup communications. You need redundancy in transport. You need more healthcare capacity than you need during peacetime. So it can easily be expanded. And this goes throughout the whole systems. Now that goes counter to the commercial logic of doing everything at lowest possible cost, least expensive, just in time, not having all these expensive extra stocks. Secondly, with people, you need to have that willingness. You need to ensure that people actually feel that they have, a stake in society, that society is working for them, and that it isn't just a world of capitalistic materialism and exploitation. And then if we're thinking back, to the Cold War, the previous era of tensions similar to they are now in the Western world. I mean, in Europe, this was the era of the welfare state. Which to a large extent were dismantled from the 1990s onwards. So it's certainly something that we need to think about how do we improve that aspect, that human aspect of feeling as if we're participating in the society, and we need to we actively want to defend. As I said, much less of a problem in Norway than other places, but certainly we can also think about how to do that.
Bruno.
Yeah, and the only thing that I would add is perhaps the importance of engaging large parts of the population in debates about strategic options. So I think that as we've been talking today, these issues, they really sit at the core of our societies. And when we are in a democratic society, citizens need to be involved. So we need to have information, we need to have our voices heard, and we need to be brought into decision-making processes. So I think that is it's very important that these fundamental decisions about how society should be mobilized, or what kind of political priorities should the government pursue. There needs to be a bottom up dimension and component to it, so that the whole society can be represented in the discussions. I think that in a democratic society, that's crucial.
Thank you. Coming up to the final question that we have for the panel. But we'll have a Q&A afterwards. So if you have questions, start preparing to raise your arms. But final question: what is the most difficult and important choice for Norwegian policymakers? Bruno, starting with you here.
Yeah. I think that the most consequential decision will have to be about, for Norway, how to use its wealth fund, and how to balance short-term objectives with longer-term objectives, and how to manage these, the challenges that we've been debating today, without compromising the cohesiveness of the society and the democratic character of the society. And in a country that is, very wealthy, that became very wealthy over the last decades, the way that this wealth is used is fundamental in shaping the direction of the society. Will this be a society that is, increasingly cohesive and with welfare protection that includes people, etc., or is it a society that goes in another direction? And so I think that the way that public policy is pursued will have implications on the way that Norwegian society is organized, and this is fundamental also for discussions about resilience and strategic options.
Thank you. Nick?
I think I'll be brief. I mean, I think in terms of defense, total defense, etc., there's a logic of control. And that that there is a need, if you're talking about defense, okay, to be able to use the resources effectively, coordinate those resources. We're talking about people as well as material things. But that logic of control conflicts with the fundamental values of a democratic society, where we want people to be able to make their own decisions about how they live their lives. And when we're talking about going deep within society, everything down to barnehage being a fundamental aspect of defense, we need to have very difficult decisions and also avoid the temptation to try and have excessive government control over these things.
Okay. Marianne?
Well, by design, democracy means that we are open to and allow for a host of different sets of opinions, but not any opinion. Like, there are restrictions when it comes to, isn't it, paragraph 100, the freedom of expression law in Norway. You cannot have statements that means that says you would like to threaten a group, for example, which comes out of the Second World War experience, of course. But how do we allow for different opinions that are not anti-democratic? I think that's going to be an increasingly difficult question to navigate.
Louise?
Yeah, that's the most difficult and important choice. Yeah, well, are you European? I don't know. Maybe that's the foundation. But I heard this this really interesting title of a book that I really liked, and that is "What Europe and What Norway." Sort of what is it that we're planning to? We're making all of these changes, and I completely agree with Bruno that time is short. But if you now start to make decisions as if time had run out, you are likely to make decisions that are going to be very costly over a longer time period, and doesn't perhaps allow you to see all the trade-offs and the variation. And I think that also goes to Nick's point in terms of how much do we actually want to see state and municipality engagement in private matters, and how do we want to maintain the responsibility at the population level. I actually had a very interesting discussion with Norwegian officers just the other day, where I think there's an interesting difference between Sweden and Norway here, when Sweden has starting to go all in terms of planning all the way down to that level, because in terms of barnehage, or the children, taking care of the children, considering that in particular certain areas that is very militarily dominated, you stand to lose about 25 to 30% of the labor force if you haven't sorted out the private aspect. So we are talking about definitely substantial costs, but it also comes with the cost of the norms. And I think one of the critical things, and you can disagree and agree with a lot of the decisions that are ongoing in the review of the Norwegian research system at the moment, but I think that starting to create surfaces between policy and decision making, so that we can bring home the 60 years of research that we now have with solid data on the impact of armed conflict on our society, that we can bring that home and actually make scenarios that are effective, that are not based on Cold War ideas or these normative ideals that we would like to see, but actually does this sort of estimate, as Marianne is talking about. Yes, it looks fantastic if you look at statistics, but if you actually go beneath that, if you scrape the surface, what can we actually expect to happen? So I think sort of formulating that in a way that respects the role of independent research, but also create these surfaces for exchange, I think is going to be very critical.
Thank you. We'll open up for questions from the audience. You need to speak into the microphone, so wait for the microphone to come to you. Anyone who wants to start off? Yes, please. And also say your name and where you're from.
Yeah, okay. My name's Ibrahim. I'm coming from Istanbul. I actually live in Norway, but I want to ask Bruno, actually. So, Bruno, how do you see the future of Norway and EU defense cooperation, especially considering the Kongsberg and, of course, Nemo's role, increasing role in the US defense ecosystem? As you know, the Kongsberg is the sole provider of JSM missiles and NSM missiles of US Navy. So I think it's a record in defense ecosystem worldwide. So how do you see Norway and EU defense cooperation?
Yeah, thanks. I think that we are in a period of transformation of the defense industrial landscape in Europe. I think that, as Nick was saying, I feel that the understanding in Europe is that the disengagement of the US is not a temporary phenomenon. And to be fair, there has been a kind of a growing signaling from Washington that that Europe is no longer top priority, but of course this has been sharply increased in the Trump administration, particularly the second one, and so I expect things to move in a direction that will point to further intra-European cooperation, but also opening up to new markets, so kind of imports and from countries that have not been usual suppliers of defense products to Europe. I think that we'll see more of that. I think that Nick can also contribute to this discussion. But what I would also say is that if we want to take this idea of European strategic autonomy seriously, we will have to accept that there is some collateral damage, and that European countries might not have access to the top equipment if the top equipment is only provided by the US. If developing a European alternative, it's something that will take some time, or that is, an alternative is available that is not, as advanced as the American option, we might have to go for that, and it might be good enough to some of the functions, to some of the the message that the European countries want to kind of to project. That might be enough. So basically, the message is, I think that we'll see more intra-European cooperation for sure. I think that we will see new markets being available, and I think that some of the costs, some of the transition costs of entering this phase are acceptable and are inevitable. But Nick, do you want to please?
Yeah, I mean, specifically on what you were saying about the missiles, etc. I mean, as much as much as people in various parts of Europe, etc., might want to end dependence upon the US, especially for F-35 aircraft, it's not going to happen anytime soon. So, it would take even more dramatic events than we've seen now for European governments to decide to end that very quickly, and they're going to carry on flying F-35s and until they become obsolete. So I don't think there's a huge trade-off for Kongsberg. But what is a bigger issue is the future. What consortiums would Kongsberg be a member of in the future? What who's it choosing to partner with? And then it may be that that there are more difficult choices being made in terms of whether it wants to partner with US firms or is encouraged to focus on partnering with European firms.
We have a question from Giacomo.
Thank you. This is Giacomo. I'm a doctoral researcher here at PRIO. I have at least one question for each of you. I will start with Marianne. you mentioned that Norway has exceptional numbers when it comes to the willingness to defense. Would you be able to expand a bit on the reasons why you think that is the case? What makes Norway an exceptional case, and what can be done to keep it that way? For Nick, you mentioned that in a context of war, what is important is that you need to have control. By having conversations with many friends, my biggest fear is that people would just not know what to do. And that chaos could be a very dangerous enemy in terms of societal preparedness. So I would want to hear more from you on what you think can be done to prevent chaos, essentially. For Luis, you mentioned different views between Sweden and Norway. And I've been thinking that Norway has been playing at many different tables when it comes to defense. One of them being obviously the national level, and then there is the Nordic level, and then there is the European Union level, and then there is NATO. Obviously, some of those are transferable, and some of the investments, both politically, economically, and diplomatically, are not necessarily transferable. So I would like to ask you if you could expand on where should Norway put its fishes or chips, I guess, and then, or Bruno, you mentioned European cooperation going forward. Now, like you, I'm from a Southern European country, and I keep repeating this anytime I can. There is a very different threat perception in the south of Europe. I'm from Italy, by the way. So discussions like the one we are having today would just be essentially impossible to have down there. Societal preparedness is not something you talk about in an academic discussion like the one we're having. So to me, I guess the question for you is, how do we take forward, considering that there is so many different imaginaries about what European defense would need to look like going forward? Okay, I can shut up now.
Thank you. That's going to keep us busy. I think we're going to start with Marianne, since you have had the longest time to think about your question. But you need to share.
Thank you, Giacomo. So I can only speculate here. It's a very high number indeed. I think it links to the universal nature of our welfare system, which is inclusive. It co-opts people into a system where you are taken care of if you are in need of it, which probably generates some social responsibility. We also have an experience from the Second World War where societal resistance was quite broad-based, and which has been celebrated afterwards throughout numerous history classes in school, which is probably a good thing here. But if you take those two items and you compare it to many other countries, you should have a very high level in many other countries also. And you do have that. So this doesn't make us different from Sweden-ish. Maybe the Second World War thing. But I think it's also puzzling. It's a bit puzzling that it is as high as it is. And of course, something could be social desirability bias, where you say, I would, of course, defend my country, while you are thinking, I will try everything I can to find a route out of it. But in order to explain the difference to other countries, you would have to assume that social desirability bias is greater in Norway than in other countries. That could be, of course. I do think it's high. How do we keep it going? Big question. I do think we have to make sure that we get people who are now living more in a digital world back into society somehow, maybe.
Luis?
Yeah, just to build on that, because and I'm not deflecting your very easy question on the latter, but there's also an interesting gender gap, just like Marina was saying. We also don't know in the willingness to defend. because it's much lower among women, also in the Scandinavian countries. And it could be the sort of that could perhaps, if you explore that, also shed some light on some of the aspects related to why we see the high levels, but also sort of what are the caveats or the risks. And that is it's because you also look at attitude surveys in the Scandinavian countries, then women are also more unsure about the role of the defense, about the investment in defense. So it can be that either it's has been traditionally a very male-dominated area, so maybe it's so you have lower levels of knowledge, you have also lower, women are not suicidal. If you don't think that you can contribute or you would survive because you don't have the ability, of course you're not going to sign up. But it has also been, in a sense, information campaigns and directed at women. So if that is the case, then we should also see that women sort of get on board more. But it can also be the questions that Nick has brought up in terms of the trade-offs between the welfare system and the military. That women tend to be more invested in those, and you also see the women sort of leaning more towards the left in many surveys because you are so reliant on the public support structures. And I think also in that, the fact that the military keeps, unfortunately, ending up in the media with harassment cases, with being known for not being a good employer, that also could draw down. So I think there are aspects here to explore further that is really interesting. Now, related to your other question on where should Norway, if I knew that, I think I would probably be hired by the MOD. But because I think you're very right. I mean, it's the national, it's the Nordic, the EU, NATO, and also the US options. And I actually did try this weekend just to sort of see where does Norway seem to be landing in, and it doesn't seem to want to land in at the present moment. And I think that is probably because it is so very much depending on where the US is going to land, and also what the credible options are within EU and NATO, and how EU and NATO is going to grow closer together in terms of its defense development, which again is depending on the US. But what I do think, and that's another thing that I think is really relevant for research, is the growing emphasis on the Nordic. Because one thing that you can transfer, as you say here, is the fact that since the Nordic is now one or possibly two, depending on how you see it, operating areas for NATO. That means that you can develop practical capabilities and plans for a very specific regions. That also makes it possible for you to handle different kinds of vulnerabilities, depending on how the US or other larger European states then land in. But I think it's $1 million question, so I think your response is probably equally good as mine.
Nick?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Giacomo. Excellent questions. I mean, how do you avoid chaos? I mean, if you're looking at total defense, the answer is preparation and planning. And, if you're talking about, a total society approach, that means everybody, is supposed to think about that. They're supposed to plan, they're supposed to prepare. We're all supposed to have the iodine tablets and 2 weeks worth of drinking water, in our houses, etc. But then, as Louisa was saying, this is an enormous cost. If you can imagine every single organization developing contingency plans, there's a whole load of people's time is just spent developing those. There is an answer, but we should also be aware of what the trade-offs are. Also, it wasn't directed at me, but I can comment on your point about Italy. I think we have to be aware of two things about Europe. Firstly, that yes, of course, Italy or Spain or other European states are less engaged than are the Nordics, the Baltics, Poland, etc. And we just have to live with that. There's nothing we can do about it. And of course, if you are proximity to Russia, proximity to Ukraine is going to have a major effect upon how you view these things. As the other thing, as I expect, Bruno might talk about as we've written it together, so I'll introduce him. If we're seeing the loss of US leadership in Europe, we're not replacing it with a European US. We don't have one. We've got lots of different countries, none of which is predominant. The EU Commission, isn't predominant. So we're just going to have a somewhat messy situation. But Bruno, I suspect, can talk more about that.
Yes, so I think that I totally agree with your assumption. It's not the assumption, with your description of the reality, that there is not a unified European sense of urgency and or threat perception. I spent 1 year in Lisbon last year working or sitting at the National Defense Institute, that is part of the Ministry of Defense, and the debates in Lisbon are different than the debates in Oslo. There's absolutely no doubt about that. Now, we can look at it and see it as a big problem. The fact that Europe doesn't have, a single shared threat perception. And so we can think about, okay, what can be done about that? And a lot of things are done about that, always with mixed results. But for example, intra-European collaboration, in research, in the military establishments, in education, and all sorts of environments. For example, the CENTREPEACE project, whose work at PRIO Nick leads. It's the collaboration of different research institutions in Europe, in different geographies. And then people come together. A lot of people will be coming to Oslo this week to participate in this European Security Week, to share different experiences. And I think that it's very important that we get this different input. So kind of this type of initiatives, they foster a kind of the emergence of a common European security culture, if we can put it like that. But there's a different, very quickly, there is a different way of looking at it, which is, let's treat the differences as an opportunity and as an added value of Europe, okay? And it's just inevitable that if you sit in Latvia or Estonia or in Poland, you'll have different concerns compared to if you sat in Madrid or in Lisbon or in Rome. I think it's just inevitable. And as long as the work is coordinated, and as long as there is a coordinated way of understanding what should be the priorities and what can a given country contribute to in order to create this increasing European resilience, it doesn't have to be a problem.
Pavel has the next question.
My name is Pavel Bayev. I'm a research professor at PRIO. My question is to Louise, and it's about gender equality. A norm we all support with no reservation. But the war poses particular challenge to it, and Ukraine brings you a perfect illustration. Men are mobilized, women can volunteer, they don't do it very much. Women are free to leave the country, men are not. So the casualties on the front line are primarily men. The emigration from Ukraine is mostly women and elderly. It's certainly shocking for me that Ukraine, in the course of this war, has lost a half of its population. That's a price which looks devastating. But do you think this experience from this war makes it necessary for us to rethink how we see gender equality in our total defense? If we go for expanding conscription Finnish style, it cannot be gender equal.
Just so I understand correctly, so what are the caveats and the challenges with gender equality in this total defense? Yes, very good. Yes, I think you put your finger on a very critical aspect, and that is, of course, that the management of the war and the effects of war are gendered. And I think that is actually an experience or an awareness that I think we might have problems carrying over to Norway, because I think, and also the other Nordic countries, because I think we still think that because we are gender equal, we don't have to think about gender because it's just going to be automatically or naturally included in all decisions. But I mean, we are going to see the same kind of effects. The military in the Scandinavian countries are male dominated. The main number of people that are lost are going to be male. They're going to be young male. Those that have going to uphold the health system that's going to provide the critical resources for rehabilitation or saving people that come in from the front line will primarily be women, just so as we saw the pandemic being a very female-dominated crisis, right? So we hadn't been able to do that without being able to mobilize women. And that's also actually where Sweden learned that you had to help sort of children, childcare and schools mobilize as part of total defense, because otherwise you cannot uphold the labor force. And I think the difference between, though, that where we have a slightly different approach is that the level of protection, so the protection norms in terms of males being the protector and women being sort of the victims to be protected, is less so when you reach a certain level of gender equality, which means that women and men will be able to mobilize in both Sweden and Norway. And actually in our countries, both women and men will actually not be allowed to leave, because we will have krigsplacering, is the Swedish term, I don't know what that is, but we have appointed positions that we have to go to if there's a war or a crisis, regardless of if you're a man or a woman. So that is actually a gender neutral decision in both of the Scandinavian countries. But I still think that because we have these entry points, we need to be even more carefully how we calculate them being able to use the whole labor force, because it will place an emphasis on the private management of the private responsibilities in a way that was not there during the Cold War or during World War II, because then we had traditional gender roles. We don't have that to the same extent anymore. So I think you're absolutely right. It requires very cautious and very calculated, but also normative thinking around how we see gender equality. And it has to be more than an emotional normative standpoint. It has to be very rational.
We have time for one more question, if there is anyone burning. No? Doesn't seem like that. Then thank you to the panelists. And thank you for coming to PRIO. And thank you to our online audience who've been listening in. And then, as Håkon mentioned, we have events every day this week on security, European security. So welcome back.